Welcome, everyone. Today we're discussing Martin Luther. I've done not as much work I wanted to do on Luther in the last couple of years, but finally the material is coming together. So thanks all for being here and for joining me for this talk. By the way, Mal is streaming right now, so there's this overlap between his talk, which is really, really interesting. So hopefully, once everyone finishes there, they'll come over to the channel and join this discussion. But Mal's found some very, very interesting material, um, which really starts to make the standard Islamic narrative fall apart. So, Century Since, welcome. Mike Simar, good to see you. Yes, one of the things I have in common is a direct line to Muhammad for advice. Yeah, Horse, of course, welcome. Just Janice, Roseanne Rossi. Drive safely and as you go home. Neil D, welcome. Dr. Jonathan Gamble, good to see you. Vagabond, welcome. Daniel Rodriguez, good evening from South Africa. Nice to see you. Thank you. Yeah, CMB, good to have you. Harry Tecklenburg, goedenavond. White Rose, good morning to you. Kush, welcome. Francis Bull, okay. Demolishing Martina Luthera, yes. Welcome, Joel Thomas. Right, let's dive into this. This paper is 83 pages long in full, but we're not going to do every one of the pages, and it's triple spaced, so it's really only 30 pages in length. Let's begin on this. I have linked it. It is in the chat. You see at the top of the chat, I have made a link to it, and it's also in the description if anyone wants it. Welcome XYZ, good to see you. Staubsauger, nice name. Locust and Honey, welcome. Tom Gyokai. All right, so Luther and Hitler, a linear connection between Martin Luther and Adolf Hitler's anti-Semitism with a nationalistic foundation. Right, let's start by going to this slide. I've covered this in the past with my talk on Hitler versus Christianity. So this is the Nuremberg trials, which happened after World War II. Welcome, Stuart's Impact. And yeah, so what you have is Julius Streicher, Nazi propagandist, published anti-Semitic paper called Der Stürmer or the Stormer. This is Mr. Julius Streicher here. So he ends up in the dock at the Nuremberg trials, and the lawyer says to him, "Witness, what aims did you pursue with your speeches and your articles in Der Stürmer?" That happened on 29 April 1946. Welcome, Artsy Fartsy and Ower. Julius Streicher says, the speeches and articles which I wrote were meant to inform the public on a question which appeared to me one of the most important questions. I did not intend to agitate or inflame, but to enlighten. Streicher, anti-Semitic publications have existed in Germany for centuries. A book I had, written by Dr. Martin Luther, was, for instance, confiscated. Dr. Martin Luther would very probably sit in my place in the defendant's dock today if this book had been taken into consideration by the prosecution. In the book, The Jews and Their Lies, Dr. Martin Luther writes that the Jews are a serpent's brood, and one should burn down their synagogues and destroy them. Streicher, the book Trust No Fox in the Field and No Jew Under His Oath was done and illustrated by a young woman artist, and she also wrote the text. The title, which appears on the picture book, is from Dr. Martin Luther. So Martin Luther, this is something I've watched numerous videos on YouTube with Protestant theologians discussing Martin Luther's anti-Semitism and working very hard to deny the obvious, deny reality, deny history, and to downplay it, to eliminate it. So let's continue onto this. There's something else I want to briefly show you. Let's go to pages number 32. There is a common story that Pope Pius XII was Hitler's pope. That is a common refrain. I've discussed it at length. That story is completely 100% false. However, we do have a formal admission of guilt from Protestants that they were complicit with the Hitler regime. We had numerous, and I mean numerous, Protestant scholars and theologians who were editing the Bible to make it align with Nazi theology and were collaborating with the Nazis. So the 1945 Stuttgart Declaration of Guilt, known as the Stuttgart Confession, was a declaration by the Council of the Evangelical Church in Germany on October 19th. It admitted that they did not oppose the Third Reich, right? And they were confessing guilt for the church's failure to resist the Nazis and their atrocities. So this was most definitely an official admission. And then, of course, you had the 1950 Weissenser Statement, was a declaration issued by the Federation of Evangelical Churches in the Soviet zone of occupation in Germany. And basically, it was a response to the Stuttgart Declaration of Guilt and aimed to provide a more comprehensive examination of the church's role in the Nazi regime and the Holocaust. So do understand there's a lot of history that Protestants have swept under the rug and claimed, no, it was Hitler's Pope, when it was anything but. But we do have Hitler's Protestants. And of course, we do have Hitler's Luther. That is very much, well, who knows? In some cases, they were very, very positive. And let's have a look at Martin Luther's theology and his ideas to understand why this would be so. Yes, Neil D., there was very strong Protestant complicity on multiple levels. Lanessa Rosal says, I'm learning so much more about Luther after going to Lutheran church. It was connected to a private school. Wild what I'm finding. Thank you for this presentation. You're welcome. Yeah. So yes, maintaining lies is very hard work. So let's have a look at this. Right. Now, this paper is from Rollins College, and she's doing a Master of Liberal Studies thesis. This was 2012, Daphne M. Olson. Links in the description. Everything is there. You can find it and download it from my archive. All right. So let's dive into this. There's a fairly lengthy discussion. Well, there's a lengthy index, and she speaks of Luther's anti-Judaism and Hitler's anti-Semitism. So let's run on to that. Now, the first part of the paper is very good. She does make a left turn and start to quote some very sketchy scholars at the end, but we'll get to that point. She says, anti-Semitism is defined as discrimination against or prejudice or hostility towards Jews. This hatred and judgment towards Jewish people is not a recent phenomenon and is not uncommon. Anti-Semitism has its origins as early as paganism, even before the existence of Christianity. This was something that was actually very prevalent also amongst the Gnostics. The Gnostics went out of their way to misinterpret and reinterpret the Bible, especially I've quoted this before in the past on my discussions on Gnosticism, where they try to claim that the God of the Jews is the father of Satan. So that they try to reinterpret one particular passage in the Bible, stating that the Jews worship the father of Satan. So yeah, so this belief obviously has made its way. Many quote-unquote Christians have taken a lot of, shall we say, education from Adolf Hitler, Martin Luther, and others, and decided that, yes, the Jews have to be genocided, the Jews are evil, but we'll get there. So, the roots of Christian anti-Semitism lie in the belief that the Jews killed Christ, the divine Savior. This belief made the Jews the enemy of Christians, causing a hatred that has lasted centuries. Two of the most notorious, unshakable anti-Semites were the Protestant reformer Martin Luther and German Chancellor turned dictator Adolf Hitler. Just zoom in a little bit more to this. The Masonic connections with him is very curious, being the Illuminati protected Luther back when the Vatican was out to attack both Illuminati and Luther. Look, I have hints of Martin Luther being very much involved in secret societies. While I haven't yet found any hard evidence, there seems to be some evidence that he may well have been very senior within certain secret societies, and within two of them possibly. But I'd need to get into the Gnostic connections with Martin Luther, his Gnostic beliefs, and then try to find more evidence for the occult connections, the secret society, things like groups that would be probably precursors of the Rosicrucians and so on. So, but who were Martin Luther and Adolf Hitler, right? They are arguably two versions of each man. Luther is renowned today as the initiator and leader of the Protestant Reformation. Now, recently, when I started discussing Martin Luther and his impact on the Reformation, of course, his leadership and initiation of the Reformation as the most important man, who was celebrated in 2017, celebrated worldwide, copious videos, copious Protestants discussing Martin Luther as a great man who initiated the Reformation, stood up against the evil Catholic Church and won. There was just video after video, historical exhibition at museums. And then, of course, when I started putting out the information on Martin Luther, suddenly, on Thaddeus' channel, for instance, Protestants started lying to me and saying very bluntly, no, Martin Luther had nothing to do with the Reformation. It was really happening long before Luther came along. There were guys called Fred and another guy called Jimmy. There was a guy called Angus, and they were involved in kicking off the Reformation 100 years before. He had nothing to do with it. Yeah, right, for sure. Definitely, because Yeah, that's what embarrassment causes. Centuries later, Lutherans and Germans alike admire and honor him for his bold and daring actions against the Catholic Church. The pervasive portrayal of Luther is simple, the young, impassioned monk who took on the Roman Church and won. However, he is much more complex with a darker side that is much less well known. Hitler was adept at hiding who he really was. He was careful not to let people get close to see behind the facade. Protestant Christians were careful to let only Luther's legacy live on, while downplaying the less favorable version. And this much is well known and is very, very true. Right, Hitler was perhaps the anti-Christian avatar of Luther as far as Jews are concerned, yeah. In a real sense, yeah. The people were very kind, but let me tell you, the head priest of the local Lutheran church came an old creepy man and what a... Okay. Upside down pentagram with Baphomet. Wow, that's weird. Yeah, so look, according, as I've discussed in the past, after Martin Luther, between the 1600s and the 1800s, what you had was Protestants trying to claim a lineage direct to the apostles, and in every case, and I've had this, I went through the evidence, the historical evidence in the past, they went through heretics, they went through the Albigensians, they went through the Cathars, they went through Gnostics. Flaming heretics were claimed as their root because anything but Catholic. So therefore they would try and find a way, and so thus flaming, obvious, known heretics were supposedly the founders of original Christianity and the forefathers of Protestant Christianity. And yeah, really, really odd. So let's continue. There is no hiding the evil that occurred under Hitler's reign. The sinister side of Luther has been well hidden since his time. Well, the internet is going to open that door. Those skeletons are going to come out of the closet, allowing only his enlightened and reformist persona to be remembered and hailed. Many would be surprised to find out that Luther was extraordinarily anti-Judaic, and he became increasingly more vile and more hateful as he aged. He wanted to convert the Jews, and he took their refusal personally, eventually became consumed with bitter hatred. His rage led to texts and sermons that explicitly detailed why the Jews were wicked and what should be done, up to and including murdering them. There is little difference between anti-Semitic ideologies of Martin Luther and Adolf Hitler. So Martin Luther was highly nationalistic, as was Adolf Hitler, although Adolf Hitler had a particular slant to his particular nationalism. Right? The descriptions of Luther continue to fit with other well-known anti-Semitic revolutionary with affection for the German people, Adolf Hitler. The significant similarities between Luther and Hitler deserve thorough exploration. More importantly, what led them to live a life filled with rage and hatred, and why was it directed towards the Jews? Now, I have seen plenty of Christians claiming Hitler was the good guy. And what's wrong with anti-Semitism? We should hate the Jews. We're supposed to hate the Jews. Jews are evil. We should kill them. That's Christians. I've seen this. It's all over YouTube. It's in the chat. It's in the comments. I've seen it. So, although Jesus, as I recall, did say, forgive them. They know not what they do. But Christians know better. And these particular Christians know better. And that's that. Okay, was there something about the German people in particular that allowed them to be susceptible to the leadership of Luther and Hitler? Now, this paper, what I'm discussing, is going to be relevant to my discussions on Martin Luther, the history of Germany, and how Luther changed the psyche of the German people, how Luther introduced warfare, introduced violence, introduced slaughter into German history, and created an aggression in German culture, which, of course, we've seen in the 20th century. As World War I and World War II, which were very much influenced by Darwinism. So he altered the psyche of the German people and left them open to these views. Francis Boole says, Protestants would refuse to call Saint Mary Mother of God because it doesn't feel right for them, but when it comes to Martin Luther, he's such a saint. Yeah, it's insane. Once we unpack Luther, you're going to discover Martin Luther was a blasphemous heretic. The man was a vile, disgusting human. Absolutely shocking human being, but we shall be discussing. So we will explain how Luther laid the foundation for Hitler's Holocaust. Now, of course, what I'm going to hear is that, that's on those people for misrepresenting and misinterpreting Martin Luther. No, they read Luther 100% and they followed Luther's 5-step plan to the letter. Okay, so let me see. Interesting that this information is not widely known. Now, when you read through academia, this is well known in silos in academic papers, It's just not something that Protestant theologians talk about. When you go through the volume of papers, you'll find that Martin Luther was known to have created an extremely warlike culture. After his passing, Germany turned warlike. War increased, right? Because Catholics bad, Protestants were the good guys, and therefore the amount of deaths due to war under the Protestants doubled, right? Protestants developed military technology to fight wars and kill people better because they were the good guys. We will get to all of that as we go. I feel much freer now that I'm certain the Pope is the Antichrist. So Martin Luther, and we're going to be going through Martin Luther was a superb propagandist. He wrote the most insulting, disgusting things. You'd be shocked at the kind of, I was shocked at the kind of thing that he wrote, the kind of things he said. But Martin Luther quite explicitly called the Pope the Antichrist, that the Pope sits with his mouth under the anus of Satan, and Satan poops into his mouth and he eats it, and they slobber it up like pigs. And I mean, man, it gets disgusting. Yes, so Protestant scholars were deliberately searching for a way to bypass 1500 years of the historical record. Yes, that's exactly what they did. Can you be anti-Zionist without being seen as anti-Semitic in today's environment? Can you be stupid while saying stupid things? Yes, you can. Because just as the whole idea of Israel, the Jews, Palestine, you've been lied to about that, you've also been lied to about what Zionism is. You've been lied to about that too. So can I accept one lie while giving some ground on another lie? Of course you can. If you want to be a liar or a half liar, 50% liar, which, yeah, sure, go ahead. You can do that, Philip. That is possible. So let's continue. It is quite difficult to get a complete understanding of Martin Luther's childhood because the information is limited. He was abused as a child. He was emotionally and physically abused as a child. He was beaten by his teacher. His mother was abusive towards him. His father was abusive. There are rumors. Now, I haven't touched on this, and I will not be touching on this really in my Luther talks because I don't find enough solid evidence beyond sort of speculation. But it's rumored that he murdered somebody. His father almost certainly murdered somebody. His father was almost certainly a murderer. They left where they lived because his father was wanted for murder or would be wanted, so they abandoned where they were. They ran away. And the man was after money and wealth and privilege and power and so on. Many biographies focus on his adult life, emphasizing his work as a monk and instigating what would become the Protestant Reformation. Erik Erikson, author of Young Man Luther, explains the literature on Luther and by Luther is stupendous in volume. It adds up to very few reliable data on his childhood and youth, his role in history, and above all, his personality remains ambiguous on a grandiose scale. What's interesting, you'll find that there's the most well-known man in history is Martin Luther. More's been written about his life. Yeah, sure. We know nothing about his early life, really. That's just been scrubbed out or thrown on the carpet or whatever. Okay. Okay, that's a very good point. Daniel Rodriguez, you can sway 1,000 men by appealing to their prejudices quicker than you can convince one man by logic. Yes, very true. So let me continue. Okay, so despite the detailed understanding of Luther's childhood, many scholars have studied his early life and are able to shed light on the nebulous early years of Martin Luther and how he became the foremost leader of the Protestant Reformation in Germany. Of course, as I said, lately I've been discovering he had nothing to do with the Reformation. Of course, Dino Dennis, Zionism was the movement to want a Jewish state. Unless you're saying that Jews should all go live in Brooklyn or something, and there were no Jews and they never had a land, they never had a state, they shouldn't own land, they should be dispossessed, they should be kicked out of the country, and you should give it to the Arabs, right? That's the option. That's the option. Martin Luther is born November 10th. That date is important, and we'll see why, because an event called the Night of the Long Knives occurs as well, where the Nazis decide to kill their political enemies. And of course, that was, in one sense, their celebration of Martin Luther's birthday, in honor of Martin Luther. They decided to murder all of their political enemies. So his family was described as rugged, rough at times, coarse, very coarse, credulous and devout. Now, of course, there are many, many stories of Luther being poor and his family. None of it's true. There are many, many stories designed to paint him in a sympathetic light, where his biographers and historians have lied about Martin Luther's circumstances to make him as sympathetic as possible. Luther was raised in an extremely strict environment, receiving whippings at home and school. Luther was quoted in 1532 saying, "One shouldn't whip children too hard. My father once whipped me so severely that I ran away, and he was worried that he might not win me back. I wouldn't like to strike my little Hans very much, lest he should become shy and hate me. Disturbing details of Luther's childhood punishments describe a child flogged until he bled. So he was whipped until he bled. Whipped as often as 15 times a day for ridiculous offenses. So this led him to isolate himself from his parents, and even perhaps led him to choose the life of a monk. It has been argued that the severity of his upbringing caused Luther to have a neurotic temperament, and that as a child he was wild and mistrustful. In other words, he would be paranoid. He had a paranoid personality, and he had wild mood swings. He was like a manic depressive. He suffered from an uneasiness of spirit, combined with melancholia. Right now, melancholia is a mood disorder characterized by persistent feelings of sadness, hopelessness, and a lack of interest in activities that person normally enjoys. So it is a more severe form of depression, right? So the man had feelings of guilt, feelings of worthlessness, feelings of self-harm, feelings of suicide, feelings of self-hatred, massive feelings of depression, and then you have euphoria. And so that was Martin Luther. These sufferings would impact Luther's later life. He was a very sickly man, just like Charles Darwin. And he suffered from scrupulosity as well. He suffered from extreme mood swings. All have been attributed to his childhood upbringing. These abrupt fluctuations in behavior have been described as extraordinarily sensitive and subject to recurrent periods of euphoria and depression. So he was not mentally well balanced. Hey there, Islamic Origins. Awesome show. I watched as much as I could. Then I came over, but really fantastic information. You are tearing the sin apart. Well done. So thank you. Yeah, so as a young man, Luther studied to become a lawyer. Now, remember, John Calvin was a lawyer. Now, we all learn that, well, Martin, he was bipolar. Yes, artsy-fartsy. Martin Luther was, for all intents and purposes, bipolar. I lived with a bipolar person once. It is madness. It was weird. It was the craziest thing. So, yes, he was bipolar. So, now, we are told Martin Luther was a great theologian. What few people know is, and at least I have not been able to find hard evidence on this, but what I've heard from discussions is that back in the day, there was no, shall we say, by default, you studied law. Law was something that you effectively studied by default. So you basically, at the universities, you came out as a lawyer, right? So you were given a law degree because they didn't have a proper theology or philosophy degree. So Martin Luther was a lawyer. So he learned how to do lawyering and speak in those legal terms and twist words and make legal arguments, just like John Calvin did. John Calvin was a lawyer. Martin Luther was a lawyer. So having already received his bachelor's and master's degrees in the field of law, he suddenly abandoned this career path to become a monk. So the story goes, there was a severe thunderstorm and he blah, blah. We all heard the story. I'm not interested. That story is probably false. The story is that he wanted to spite his parents and he went to become a monk, or they wanted him to have an arranged marriage, and to spite his parents, he became a monk to avoid a marriage he didn't want. That's the stories that I've read. As a scholar, Luther completed his doctorate in theology in 1512. He gave numerous lectures on the Bible, and then he posted his 95 theses on the door of the castle at Wittenberg. That story of him posting, nailing the thesis to the door of the castle, that apparently was written by his colleague Melanchthon, and that apparently arose 30 years after his death. So we don't know if it's actually true. It seems to be a legend created 3 decades after he died. So the popularity of Luther's theses subsequently prompted the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. As we know from people on Thaddeus' channel, as I learned, Luther had nothing to do with the Reformation. Nothing. So, okay, fine and well. So, now, he was supposedly terribly disturbed with many of the practices of the Catholic Church, especially indulgences. Now, we know from historical records that the Catholic Church was well aware of the issues with indulgences in terms of being abused, and of course, they were already taking action. So to my mind, this is merely a pretext. This was a pretext he was using to point a finger so that he could then slip in, because the Catholic Church is selling indulgences. That's bad. You know what we need to do? We need to edit the Bible, remove books from the Bible, and we need to make some changes to various verses to make them better. Because editing the Bible, changing the Bible, removing theology that had been around for 1500 plus years, that's the only way to fix indulgences, apparently. But okay, fine, Luther, whatever you say. So Now, I'm not going to get into what indulgences are right now. That's for another day. Luther believed, well, let me just read it. An indulgence is defined by the Catholic Encyclopedia as a remission of the temporal punishment due to sin, the guilt of which has been forgiven. Now, of course, the typical claim is that you pay for an indulgence and you will have your sin taken away, which is false. That is not true, but it's a common story, right? The idea is that you would have a lengthy time of penance due after you've confessed your sins and been forgiven. So for remission from your penance, you donate to the church. So that's the basic story there. Now, Luther believed that the consequences of sin could only be removed by faith in the gospel, and not by words, not by confessions, not by payments, or by other good works. In other words, you just got to believe, and then you have to do nothing at all. Be lazy, and God will save you. That's pretty much the message Luther came with. We've already discussed, as I did with my talks on Pius X, that this was what the mystics were doing, and this, of course, led them into heresy and error. So let me see. I know someone was healed of their bipolar condition. I thought you'd fall apart when husband died. Yeah. So bipolar is pretty crazy. So, okay, let me see. The Catholic Church used the payment of indulgences to fund churches, monasteries, and other projects. Especially irritated with the treatment of Germans by the Italian papacy, used these sermons as a venue to speak out against the Pope, the pastors, and the bishops. Of course, Protestants today do not speak out against the what we call the prosperity gospel, which is a corruption of the gospel. God wants you to be rich. Give me lots of money. I need a private jet. But that's okay, even though that his indulgences turned up to $1 billion. Yeah, but that's okay. It's indulgences are fine when Protestants do it. That's the story that I see. Okay, let's jump over this. So in 1521, he arrives for the Diet of Worms in triumphal procession. Remember, Martin Luther was regarded in Germany as a prophet. Not only that, he himself thought he was a prophet. He spoke of himself as a prophet. So he was greater than just your average theologian. He was the new prophet. He spoke with the authority of Christ, direct from his mouth. So let me see. For a guy advocating sola scriptura, the tinkering of scripture was completely wild. Yes, I'm going to go into that when we get into my story, because the Bible is perfect, except we need to really remove like a dozen books and we need to make a lot of edits to it. So let me continue here. I looked this up once, and he got a master's in liberal arts, which was the base for pretty much all higher degrees. Yeah. So in 1521, he arrives at the Diet of Worms. He was escorted to the gate by 100 mounted soldiers. Interesting. 2,000 townspeople came out to accompany him. And the name Luther would symbolize faith, freedom, and the defiance of religious authority. Yeah, in other words, this is the privatization of religion, the privatization of theology. I will make up my own theology, as we've discussed. Okay, let me see. Following a person in poor faith. Yeah. Okay, so in Luther's Germany, there was a class struggle between the princes and the peasants. And we know that Luther obviously came down on the side of the princes, and he got a lot of peasants murdered. So Luther called the princes. Now, okay, so the peasants came to him because they wanted support, because they were being abused. The peasants were being abused by the princes, right? These poor peasants. So Luther called the princes the greatest fools and the worst scoundrels on earth. The people will not any longer endure your tyranny and your presumption. And with this encouragement and united front from the peasants, a revolt ensued in 1525. Martin Luther refused to officially stand as the peasants' leader, though. And he said it was not his place as a minister to take the sword, and instead he sided with the princes. Martin Luther wrote against the murderous and thieving hordes of peasants, of which the most famous line read, "Therefore let everyone who can smite, slay, and stab, secretly or openly, remembering that nothing can be more poisonous, hurtful, or devilish than a rebel." So Martin Luther writes. So Martin Luther says, "Oh, those princes are bad. You peasants are being oppressed." And then when the peasants revolt, Martin Luther sides with the princes and writes that everyone should take up weapons and murder the peasants. They should kill them, stab them, slay them, secretly or openly, because there's nothing more poisonous or hurtful than these peasants. To Luther, if a peasant was willing to rebel, then he was outside the law of God and deserved what was coming to him. When it was over, 100,000 peasants were killed, and Luther was labeled a traitor by the peasants. The Catholic princes held Luther responsible for the entire episode. Nothing compares to however, nothing compares to Luther's vicious attitude towards the Jews, which he chronicled in his own sermons and books. So this is a basic, simple insight into Martin Luther. Incites the peasants, sides of the princes, tells the whole country to murder the peasants, gets 100,000 peasants killed. That's Martin Luther. Did we learn this in Sunday school? Because I don't remember this at all. I seriously don't recall someone telling me this. So Luther's nationalism. I cannot and I will not recant anything against for to go against conscience. Now he means my personal will. To go against what I want, my own selfish will, is neither right nor safe. Here I stand, I can do no other. Right? So help me God, Martin Luther. So Martin Luther and German nationalism are inextricably linked. It has been argued that Luther's message was not for Christendom, but for the German people. For he was not a Christian, he was first and foremost a German. That quote comes from, this is Wiener, I've read the book. Martin Luther, Hitler's spiritual ancestor. A very interesting read, actually, really interesting read. So, now, so Luther considered himself the prophet of the Germans, and he literally spoke of himself as a prophet. I've covered that in depth, and I will do again in my upcoming Luther series. And he says, I am the prophet of the Germans. I will act as a faithful teacher, and I will get 100,000 of you slaughtered if you go against the big guys who pay me lots of money and made me rich, because my name is Martin Luther, and I like the princes and not you smelly peasants, and everyone should kill you. That was Martin Luther. I've been born for my beloved Germans, and for them I will die, although I have no problem getting 100,000 of you killed. So anyone who disagreed with him, he called into question their patriotism and refused them the right to be called a German. You disagree with Martin Luther, you're not a German, you're a bad human, 99999. Some have argued that Luther was not the champion of freedom and liberty after all, but rather he was the voice of Germanism, which dreams that in matters of religion, culture, government, and race, the Germans should be the master of mankind. Heck, have we heard that? There's a guy called Hitler that says something like that? German supremacy? I wonder. So understand, I'm not going to go back to every source that I said, download the paper, go look at the sources yourself. But what I want to indicate is that there is a story about Luther that we've not been told. A story that is well known, well documented, but has not been shared openly, because it would utterly destroy the reputation of Martin Luther, as well as undercut the Protestant religion. The history of the Protestant religion is, to put it bluntly, a joke from the history that I've seen. So there you go. So that's a fascinating. Okay, now by listening to Germans speaking in the streets and combining a variety of dialects, Luther created a new, distinct language for all Germans, and thus earned the label the father of the German language. Right? So Luther created the modern German language. He aroused in the people not only a new Protestant vision, of Christianity with a fervent German nationality, but he taught them, at least in religion, the supremacy of the individual conscience. Let's have a look at that. That's Jim Walker, Martin Luther's dirty little book on the Jews and their lies, a precursor to Nazism. So that's Jim Walker, Martin Luther's dirty little book on the Jews and their lies, a precursor to Nazism. Fascinating. But this is true. Remember, I have discussed this at length in the past. Martin Luther simply did state that every Christian in his conscience is his own church and his own pope. That means you have 1 billion churches and popes if you're a Protestant. That means you are personally, privately, your own theologian, you make up your own theology. So in religion, you have the supremacy of the individual conscience. That makes you a mystic and makes you a Gnostic. It does not make you Christian. So Luther used religion for his own ends. Yes, Just Janice, that's a very fair point. I would agree with that, yes. So centuries since, you say this is crazy. So tell me more about what's crazy. I'd like to like the comments. So Oof, my mom heard what I'm listening to. Her comments are ridiculous. So yeah. So guys, look, if you like what I do, please do subscribe, do share the material, do give it a like to spread this to other people. Do support the channel. Of course, I'm not making friends by making the content that I'm making. What I do is highly contentious. What I do, unfortunately, is upsets people. These are the facts. This is what I believe we can most distinctly validate from historical sources, from genuine historical sources. This is the side of history we've not been told. This is the whole truth, not the massaged truth that we've been lied to about. So, now Martin Luther's nationalism stemmed in part from the fact that the Germans were despised by other nationalities, according to conversations recorded by John Schlagenhaufen. You'll find a lot of those in Luther's works. Remember, I have the entire Luther's work series. Thanks to my audience, I was able to buy the full Luther's works in English. I have the entire series of 58 volumes. It cost like $380. So thank you very much for that, everyone. We are able to look at this. These are the official historical records of Martin Luther. So he was one of the young men who lived in Luther's home in the 1530s. Luther believed that no nation was hated as the German nation. Italians referred to Germans as beasts, and all the other nationalities mocked them. During a dinner conversation in April 1532, Luther was quoted as saying, "Who knows what God intends to do and will do with the Germans, though in God's eyes we've undoubtedly deserved a beating." Neil D says, if not for Lloyd, I would still have a Walt Disney version of Luther in my mind. Yeah, thank you. So, Luther's own opinions of Germans was more favorable. He argued that the way Germans spoke was indicative of this, and the German language was the most perfect language of all. Arabic is the perfect language. Therefore, we must write the Bible in Arabic. German is the most perfect language, and therefore we must write. I know someone's going to say, well, Luther wrote the very first non-Catholic Bible that wasn't in Catholic Latin. And bullshit. So, yeah, that story's going around a lot. Anyway. Okay, and he said it's most likely because of the resemblance to Greek. Okay, whatever you say, man. So, the problem is that Luther rejected a whole bunch of biblical books because they were found in the original Greek and not in Hebrew. So, yeah, whatever, Luther. Did the Anglicans exist? No, they did not. The Anglicans came much later. I'm a Catholic and curious to know what Luther. No, the Anglicans did not exist at the time. They were Catholics. England was Catholic. So, okay. So, let me see. Oh, he spoke of Germans excelled all other nations in this regard in marital fidelity and all that. But we'll skip all this. This is not important. Okay? So, Luther was shown to us as a great man fighting for freedom, tolerance, independence. The man who exclaimed, "Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise. May God help me. Amen." Luther, the honest, cheerful, decent German who fought a corrupted, immoral Rome. Luther, honored by Protestants everywhere, the hero of Germany and the Protestant world. A terrifying, dirty, dishonest Luther appeared. A Luther much blacker and more hideous by far than all his opponents taken together had depicted him. So that is in Hitler's Spiritual Ancestor. Okay, so take that source, that particular source, as you will, but I will be going through sources that I can verify, as much as possible from very good historians, really credible historians, and Luther's own works and own words. My dad speaks German from Bavaria. Interesting. Okay, that's one of many beautiful languages. Yeah, well, if you've tried to understand Bavarian German, it's really hard. Okay, so there was a time when young German students would look up to Luther with overwhelming enthusiasm as a German hero, as the ideal German manhood. Less familiar is the moody, erratic, and anti-Semitic Martin Luther. The unpredictable mood swings that afflicted him as a child continued throughout his entire life, with examples of Luther's frenzy often recorded by those who knew him well. Dr. Paul J. Reiter, a psychiatrist and one of Luther's students, dissects Luther's life into phases. The period between age 22 and 36 is the Krankheitsphase. This is the sickness phase, followed by a period of manic productivity and a breakdown in his 40s. The Krankheitsphase, which describes a state of sickness, is what Reiter defines as one drawn-out state of nervous disease. The renowned dynamic Martin Luther that he studied and epitomized, therefore, only existed for a short time between periods of neurotic tensions. So you've got a short period that is idolized, and then Luther went nuts. Dr. Obvious says Luther was demonically possessed likely his entire life. So, if not demonically possessed, certainly influenced, and if not demonically influenced, very disturbed. Very disturbed. So let me see. Let's continue. Okay, this is Erickson, Young Man Luther, a study in psychoanalysis and history. You've got Ritter, Luther, his life and work, and so on. Let's continue. And then they mentioned here, he only existed for a short time between periods of neurotic tensions and a severe breakdown. In other words, severe mental and emotional breakdown. So the life of the older post-breakdown Luther included an amplified agitation with the Jewish population and increasingly anti-Semitic statements. Right? Luther's anti-Semitism. What shall we Christians do with this rejected and condemned people, the Jews? Martin Luther. Martin Luther was constantly tormented by the devil. To Luther, Satan was not simply a symbol of evil, but was a physical reality to be dealt with on a daily basis because Satan would visit him. Luther used a variety of metaphors to describe the complex relationship between God, the devil, and humans. In one such metaphor, humans are simply a horse to be ridden by either God or Satan. So you're a horse and God rides you. Thanks, Luther. That's a great image. That sounds really Christian. I'm sure that's probably on page 3 of the New Testament. I'm sure Mark said that. While another describes humans as God and Satan's battlefield, his fear of the devil prejudiced his feelings towards the Jews. Luther believed that the Jews, like all his enemies, were devils. He spent numerous years trying to convert Jews to Christianity, but to no avail. So his early tolerant attitude would develop into a fierce hostility. He came to view them as stubborn foes of God who persisted in rejecting the Father of Jesus Christ, who in Luther's eyes is their own God. He will consider them as public enemies of Christianity who deserve mercy only if they convert. Now remember, he said in his final sermon just before his death, he stated, "We should have killed them all." Lots of Christians might not overtly state that, but that is ultimately the implication behind their own anti-Semitism, which they got from people like Hitler and Luther. And of course, they believe this is Christian. Luther will strive to protect Christianity from what he perceives as their blasphemous denunciations of Christian beliefs. Okay, so Martin Luther is so admired by Protestant Christians to this day that there are few well-known books that detail his anti-Semitic beliefs, if they are mentioned at all. The books that do mention his anti-Semitism, many attempt to justify it. This has resulted in a fairly biased view of Luther, portraying him as good and righteous, while hiding his darker and more sinister side. The Martin Luther that we have come to know and understand is only one part of the whole man. He has been described as being the first to spread this belief in Germany. He wrote 3 anti-Jewish books, the most famous of which is Of the Jews and Their Lies. A highly controversial book, it is not a well-known text. A translator of the text argues that we became increasingly convinced that of a well-organized plot to keep this book hidden. So a well-organized plot to keep this book hidden exists. And that is Martin Luther, The Jews and Their Lies, South Carolina, Liberty Bell Publications. So the translator is saying that there's a Protestant plot to keep this book secret. Whether or not such a plot exists, Luther's anti-Judaic texts and beliefs remain in the shadow of his accomplishments. So early Christians, including Jesus himself, were actually Jews. Although, of course, don't forget, part of the reason for the removal of what was what Martin Luther came to call the Apocrypha being a term to insult those books, right? It was a term to demean those books that are considered deuterocanon in the Catholic Church, right, which have standing within the Catholic Church and within the Orthodox churches. Martin Luther called them the Apocrypha, and he had them ultimately they were removed. Now, they were in the original King James Bible, they were in Martin Luther's Bible, but of course he moved them into a special place. The reason was that this created a much longer intertestamental gap of 500 years because there was an effort from Wycliffe and others to remove the idea, any trace of Judaism from Christianity, to make it look like it had no connection, no history at all to Judaism. Whereas if you retain the Apocrypha, as Martin Luther called it, or the Deuterocanon, there's a much shorter intertestamental gap, and you see a much clearer flow from Old Testament to the Deuterocanon into the New Testament. You see the symmetry. You see that there's this clear line from one to the other. Okay, Bearing False Witness by Rodney Stark. Yeah, look in my archive for that. Luther added fuel to the fire. Luther became increasingly more angry and anti-Judaic with age. Right, so Luther argued that stronger actions were required to deal with the Jewish problem. He declared to his fellow Christians, next to the devil, you have no more bitter, more poisonous, more vehement an enemy than a real Jew who earnestly desires to be a Jew. Wasn't there a guy called Muhammad that said something similar to that? Am I wrong? Am I wrong? Hey, let me know. Did a guy called Muhammad say something very, very similar? In order to spread his vicious anti-Judaic sentiments, he requested that other pastors and preachers follow his example and issue warnings of their own against the Jews in 1543. His anti-Jewish text, which spelled out, he wrote his own anti-Jewish text, which spelled out exactly what should be done with those Jews that refused to convert to Christianity. So let me see. If you don't, die Synagogen mit Feuer anzustecken, ihr Häuser zu zerbrechen und zu zerstören, die religiösen Schriften wegzunehmen, zum Lehrverbot für die Rabbiner, nach Aufhebung des Geleitschutzes und Reiseverbot. Okay, let's switch to English. So Martin Luther says, well, okay, so to deal with these Jews that won't convert to Christianity, let's see, step 1, we burn their synagogues. Step 2, we break into and destroy their houses. Step 3, we take away their prayer books. Step 4, we forbid their rabbis to teach. Step 4, we abolish their escort and we ban travel. Now hold on, this is starting to sound a little bit like the Pact of Umar, or am I just misreading this? We must prohibit usury, and we must force young Jewish girls and boys to work. Why? Because Arbeit macht frei. Last I checked. Let's have a quick look at that. You see, let me just bring this up. You see, so we must put young Jewish boys and girls to work because Arbeit macht frei. I wonder where Martin Luther, I wonder where Adolf Hitler got that idea. One has to wonder. One has to wonder if Adolf Hitler got this idea somewhere. Hard to tell. Really, really difficult to tell the source. So let me see. Indeed, thanks for telling me this important story. So why is Martino sounding like Muhammad? This is disturbing. Yes, the Pact of Umar 2.0. This guy sounds like an authoritarian tyrant. He was an authoritarian tyrant. That was, again, people claiming Jesus talks to them directly and they know better. No, he literally said that. His words were the words of Jesus. The words of Jesus coming right out of his mouth. That was the story. Almost impossible to create a doctrine of resurrection from the Old Testament without the Deuteros. Yeah, this is surely why Paul caused so many riots in synagogues by his preaching. Interesting point. So this is basically Kristallnacht. Exactly. Kristallnacht was a celebration of Martin Luther's birthday. Was he a closet Muslim? Was the same toxic idea adopted by, I don't know if he was a closet Muslim. I think he was a closet mystic. I think he was a closet totalitarian freak. He was almost certainly, there's a chance he was the head of at least potentially 2 secret societies. So he was almost certainly a Gnostic in a real sense, a Manichaean style Gnostic. So yeah. So let me see. So Luther wanted to burn synagogues, burn them all to the ground, break into and destroy their houses, take away their prayer books, forbid the rabbis to teach, abolish their escort and ban them from traveling, prohibit them lending money, and force young Jewish boys and girls to work, which labor camps, everyone. Luther viewed Jews as a heavy burden to Germans in their country, like a plague, pestilence, and nothing but misfortune. He passed away only 3 years after writing his violently anti-Semitic text. Remember, his very last sermon, which for some reason no record is of it, but there were notes that mentioned things he said, but no one wrote a transcript of it. He stated, we should have killed them all. Right? He wanted the genocide of the Jews. 4 days before his passing, he gave one last sermon. It was against the Jews. So Martin Luther's last sermon was against the Jews. Luther's hatred for the Jews was taken to an unprecedented level. His texts were so violent and vulgar that they offended contemporaries and remain offensive to this day. I will discuss this topic at length when I get into my Martin Luther series, okay? When I will be discussing and providing more evidence on this. This powerful, deep-seated loathing towards Jews has been uncharacteristically virulent to Germany. It flourished again in the 1900s with Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, who greatly admired Martin Luther and his anti-Semitic views. Now, this guy wrote some really good stuff. Mark Edwards, Luther's Last Battles, Politics and Polemics. That's some brilliant work this guy did. Not a Catholic as well, just so by the way. Luther was an undercover Mohammedan. Yeah, in a real sense, yeah. Secret societies and intentional international lodges that spread to the Arab lands too. Now, yeah, so perhaps the origins of the Freemasonry network, yeah. So I was talking about the Rhineland massacres that happened at the start of the First Crusades. People claiming directly talking with Jesus. Now, Martin Luther and Calvin all claimed the same thing. So Protz would say Luther became senile. Yeah, whatever. So the life of Hitler. So the art of leadership consists in consolidating the attention of the people against a single adversary and taking care that nothing will split up that attention. Adolf Hitler. Well, Martin Luther focused everyone's attention and hatred on the Jews and made sure that nothing took away from that attention. Because if Adolf Hitler said it, then, I mean, it's Christian, right? Because Martin Luther did it. And I see lots of Protestants, don't lie to me, I've seen lots of Protestants defend Martin Luther and make very similar claims. Unlike Martin Luther, there is ample information available on Adolf Hitler's childhood and adult life. Okay, he was German Bavarian by blood, and he was Austrian only by borders. He was born in the little city on the Inn, as Hitler called it, all right, of Braunau am Inn. And he says it was German Bavarian by blood and Austrian only by borders. So technically, he felt he was German. Okay, was it neurosyphilis? Now, yes, Martin Luther very likely did suffer from syphilis. Martin Luther was a very sickly man, and I have discussed, and I will discuss again, but remember, he writes to his wife in one letter that he was no longer getting aroused by staring at prostitutes, and he blamed the Jews for his illness. Okay, so hold on, Martin Luther's not getting turned on by the sight of prostitutes. What is he up to, and why is he telling his wife that? Fine and well, but we'll discuss again in the future. So now, in addition, Hitler had an inability to fit in and follow any will but his own. An uncertainty of his personal future nevertheless depressed Adolf Hitler. And then things change. According to Mein Kampf, My Jihad, okay, after considerable research and discussion, Hitler recognized the Jew as the leader of the social democracy, the Marxists. And that is when the blinders fell from our eyes. Suddenly a long spiritual struggle came to an end. Yes, Martin Luther said that. Okay, I've discussed it many times on this channel. I've discussed it. I've showed the resources plenty of times on my channel. I will be doing it again. We'll be doing a whole lovely discussion of Martin Luther and why he's a great Christian and why we should all follow him. Okay, so once Adolf Hitler discovered that the Jews are responsible for everything, and we have to hate the Jews because the Jews are responsible for everything that's wrong in the world, which is exactly the very same thing that Muhammad and the Muslims say. And Hitler said it, and Martin Luther said it. That makes it all very Christian. Of course, it's incredibly Christian because Luther said it, and Hitler said it, and Muhammad said it, so it has to be right, I think. Okay, so a life of politics as leader of the National Socialist Party would eventually give Hitler the power to confront the so-called Jewish problem head on. Right? So, Hitler, Germany will either be a world power or will not be at all. Adolf Hitler. So, he believed that Austria must return to the great German mother country, not for economic reasons, but because common blood belongs in one common realm. So, very nationalistic. Right? The reunification of the German countries and the greatness of Germany became Hitler's lifelong goal. In his manifesto, My Jihad, Hitler declares that as a boy and young man, he often wished he could demonstrate that my nationalistic enthusiasm was no empty obsession. His intense nationalism and hatred for non-Aryan people were the catalysts. We'll be discussing as well when I get to Luther of how under Luther, Germany eventually became a place where they hated anyone that wasn't one of them. If you weren't one of them, a believer of their stripe, you were the other. You were hated, and you could well be killed. You were definitely not on their Christmas list. So the hatred for non-Aryan people were the catalyst for the extreme methods for attaining the dream of united and superior German people, for which Hitler became notorious. And he won the support of the German people with his emotionally charged speeches. Remember, he won the vote because of the Protestants, right? Not because of the Catholics. So Hitler had a unique understanding of human perception and became quite adept at understanding the impact of propaganda and how to manipulate its usage. Martin Luther was brilliant at propaganda as well. Hitler himself took charge of all the Nazi propaganda in the early stages of the party, just as Luther did, oddly enough, and he incorporated this knowledge into his speeches. He purposefully used red posters to attract communists to National Socialist Party meetings as an example of his propaganda manipulation, because red was the color of the Communist Party. The objective was to entice the communist Germans into attending Nazi meetings by mistake, in hopes of re-evaluating their sense of nationalism. Hitler understood the emotional impact of symbols and insisted that the party must have their own unique flag, symbol, and colors to feel united. Hitler himself designed the red, black, and white flag, the most striking and harmonious color combination according to Hitler, with the Hakenkreuz, known as the hooked cross. The hooked cross. It's a cross. The hooked cross. The red represented the socialist ideals of the movement. The red of the Nazi flag, right? If we go to the Nazi flag, the red represents socialism. Okay, so let's have a look at the Nazi flag. Now, what is odd is you'll see people telling you, but the Nazis. I typed Nazi flag by accident. Let me just do this again. But they weren't socialists, even though it's in the name. It's not socialists. Okay, Nazi 1939. Good grief. Okay, yeah. So let me go to Google. Great. So what we have is the Nazi flag is red because red is the color of socialism, communism. That's the color of communism. That is why it is red. And of course, everyone wants to tell you that the Nazis were not socialists. They were on the right. No, they were on the political left. They were socialists. They were a particular kind of socialist. Right. And the white represented the nationalist. The Hakenkreuz, okay, represented the fight of the Aryan man, the jihad, sorry. The Hakenkreuz, the hooked cross, represented the fight of the Aryan man, the jihad of the Aryan man. Right. Those who want to live, let them fight, and those who do not want to fight in this world of eternal struggle do not deserve to live. Now, Hitler got that from Darwin, because Hitler was a very severe, very strong Darwinist. Right. So now you've got Adolf Hitler is without a doubt considered the most prominent and most fanatical anti-Semite in the history of the world. Hitler, however, would presumably have given Martin Luther that honor. In My Jihad, Hitler blames both the conspiratorial Jews and what he considers the race problem as primary causes for Germany's downfall during World War I. Hitler would see Marxists as Jews. Everybody was Jewish, right? So, to combat the perceived evils of capitalism, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, authors of the Communist Manifesto, devised 10 measures that would be applicable in most advanced communist countries, acknowledging that they will vary from country to country. So the communist concept will vary, but they had the 10 commandments of communism, right? They had to abolish property, right? The abolition of property, a graduated income tax, abolition of all right of inheritance, the centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. So there you've got a little bit of communism coming in there. And free education for all children in public schools. So when Hitler took complete power in 1933, he arrested most German communist leaders almost immediately and shipped most of them to concentration camps. Now here's where the Christians and the others are going to go, not a single Jew died in a concentration camp. It's all fiction. It's never happened. Not a single Jew. Now hold on. So Hitler murdered tens of thousands of Poles in concentration camps. He murdered Slovaks. He murdered retarded people. Like, he murdered a whole bunch of people, hundreds of thousands in camps, but not a single Jew because he absolutely positively loved the Jews, right? He hated the Jews more than anything on earth, but he never touched a hair on their head, right? So that makes perfect sense. So yeah, but he murdered a bunch of Polish people, a bunch of Slavs, but he shipped people to concentration camps that didn't exist or whatever. So the result of Hitler's immediate retaliation upon receiving complete political control resulted in a generation of German communists seeing its ranks decimated by the war and the Nazi extermination campaign that apparently never happened. Okay, because lots of people have told me not a single Jew died in a concentration camp. It's all lies, it's all lies, it's all lies. Okay, let's continue. The Nazis began first passing laws that denounced the Jews' German citizenship and prohibited them from working specific professions. Additional laws also segregated Jews from using the same transportation, schools, public facilities, and even park benches as non-Jews. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, the Nazis carried out a widespread night of violence against the Jews. They burned down over 1,000 synagogues and looted even more. Now that was following Martin Luther's orders. Crueler methods were developed, such as ghettos. The ghetto is right across the street from where I am, here in Poland, here in Warsaw. Forced sterilizations, mercy killings, work camps, and extermination camps in an effort to cleanse and purify the Aryan race. That's a Darwinian creed he's following. The cleansing process was based on eugenics, the principle of strengthening a biological group on the basis of ostensible hereditary worth. In My Jihad, Hitler acknowledged that to avoid blood pollution by mixing with lesser races, restrictions must be placed to determine who can procreate. To ensure effective well, yes, Nuam, of course, my fight, mein Kampf, my jihad. To ensure effective enforcement of Hitler's race law, sterilizations were carried out on a large scale. Those designed as hereditarily sick and life unworthy of life were sterilized, to include people with the following difficulties: mental deficiency, schizophrenia, manic depressive insanity, epilepsy, Huntington's chorea, hereditary blindness, hereditary deafness, bodily malformation, and hereditary alcoholism. An estimated 410,000 people were sterilized. Sometimes the sterilization was simple, only a vasectomy or ligation of the ovarian tubes, but they often preferred to completely remove the uterus or use irradiation for sterilization. So they wanted to have as many unfit people as possible sterilized. The biggest victims were the Jews, to ensure they did not pollute the pure Aryan race. In 1935, laws were passed that prohibited Jews from marrying or having any sexual relations with Aryans. The Nazi euthanasia program, the Canadians are following in that now, because the euthanasia program, the Nazis had sent them to the dock to be killed, right? They were hung to death, and they had the Nuremberg trials for that. And now, of course, Justin Castro, of Canada, is doing exactly the same thing and calling it healthcare. So the Nazi euthanasia program wanted to eliminate the incurably ill with mercy killings for those deemed unfit, which included the Jewish population. So psychopaths, the mentally retarded, and other inferior persons must be isolated and killed. The Jewish population fell into the category of unfit or inferior. The Nazis attempted to shroud these killings behind the veil of mercy, declaring that the people would eventually die anyway, and that killing them was merciful and humane. Children were put to sleep by ingesting luminol. Right, so that the child would give the appearance of simply being sedated. So when it came to euthanizing the adults, the Nazis tried different methods. According to an article in a 1939 Nazi magazine, the goal was to exterminate 1 million people, including hanging, shooting, and explosives. However, the cleanup was too time-consuming and inefficient. Nazi doctors eventually took over the killing process, turning the process into medical killings, giving the doctor full advantage to experiment with a variety of techniques. One method included starvation, leaving the victims to perish from malnutrition, infections, or other illnesses. Wow, thank you very, very much. By the way, left means sneaky in German. Links. So, well, thank you very much. So that's Rotom Electric. Thank you very much for that donation. I do appreciate it. Thank you. So we're discussing what Adolf Hitler did, and then we're going to start to look back and see what are the motivations coming from Martin Luther that led to this. Another type of euthanasia came in the form of injections. Doctors would inject a variety of medications, including but not limited to morphine, scopolamine, Veronal or barbital, luminol, phenobarbital, or a combination. The most well-known part of Hitler's extermination plans were the concentration camps, for which the Jewish people were the biggest target, and the gas chambers the most notorious method. The Nazis first created ghettos to force the Jews into restricted areas and labor camps to use Jews for work. The most infamous camps were the extermination camps where millions of Jews were killed. The first concentration camps were created after Hitler's rise to power as Chancellor in 1933. 6 specific extermination camps were created in former Polish territories, killing centers designed to carry out genocide. Nazis experimented frequently to increase the number of people that they could kill. Okay, let's move on. Now let's get back to Luther and Hitler. Let's start drawing lines here. So the line of anti-Semitic descent from Luther to Hitler is easy to draw by Lucy Davidovich. Let's have a look. Luther and Hitler were not the first two men to face a Jewish problem, as they called it. Okay? Few men in history have documented such abhorrence towards a people that has spanned decades and centuries. Hatred as intense as Luther's and Hitler's towards the Jews was not only unprecedented and has rarely been duplicated since. The level of bitter loathing and anti-Jewish ideology was virtually the same despite a 4-century gap. Both men were led by a strong sense of German nationalism and a yearning for unity among their fellow Germans. Nuam, the Palestinians were members of the Nazi party during the war already. The Palestinians have been highly fond of Hitler and Hitler's message for a very long time. Right? The Nazi Mufti of Jerusalem joined the Nazis voluntarily, was a general in the SS. The largest SS division in the German army at one time was the Muslim division. Muslims have been Nazis since they've been Nazis, right? Muslims fought for the Nazis. Muslims supported the Nazis. The Muslims are not responding to Israel. The Muslims are simply responding to what has been taught to Muslims since the beginning. Right, let's continue. Now, this author writes here, but according to Elaine Pagels, author of The Origins of Satan, Elaine Pagels talks more bullshit than does Bart Ehrman. This woman, I'm like, yeah, sorry, I can't believe a word that woman says. Okay. Anyway, so let's go on and listen to some of this nonsense. Ideas that Martin Luther harbored and shared, but that he himself did not execute. So I'm just ignoring a whole bunch of Elaine Pagels nonsense. But so ideas that Martin Luther harbored and shared, but that he himself did not execute. Hitler simply used Luther's original concepts of handling the Jewish problem and put them into action, and that much is true. Looking back upon Luther's instructions on what should be done with the Jews, it would seem that Hitler followed them rather closely. During the Kristallnacht of 1938, the Nazis burned thousands of synagogues. The creation of ghettos simultaneously allowed the Nazis to break into the houses of the Jews and destroy their property, while restricting their mobility and travel. New laws constrained the profession of Jews that they were allowed to possess. Concentration camps forced all Jewish boys and girls and men and women to work. Remember, Martin Luther wrote, burn their synagogues, break into and destroy their houses, take away their prayer books, and forbid the rabbis to teach, abolish their escort, ban their travel, prohibit usury, and force young Jewish boys and girls to work. Once Luther's initial steps were followed, Hitler went beyond and added his own to the list: prohibit Jews from marrying or having relations with Aryans, move Jews into ghettos, sterilize those deemed inferior, including Jews, and exterminate life unworthy of life, including Jews. So, Hitler continued and achieved the work of Martin Luther. That quote is from Wiener, Martin Luther, Hitler's spiritual ancestor, page 78 to 79. So, while German Jews considered themselves Germans, neither Luther nor Hitler viewed them as such. They were Jewish, not German. Luther and Hitler viewed the Jewish community not only as a religious congregation, but as a separate race. By default, then, Jewish meant anti-German. Right, let's continue. Hitler argues that the Jewish people are parasites to other cultures because they lack their own territory, surviving only by enslaving the members of other civilizations with their cleverness. Martin Luther's sentiments were comparable. He also considered Jews as parasitic foreigners. They live among us in our homes, under our protection. They use land and highways, market and streets. Prince and government sit by, they snore and have their mugs open. Let the Jews take from their purse and chest, steal and rob whatever they will. That is, they permit themselves and their subjects to be abused and sucked dry, and reduced to beggars with their own money through the usury of the Jews. For the Jews as foreigners certainly should have nothing, and what they have certainly must be ours. I believe Martin Luther here is making a case for theft. So he's making a case for stealing from people. Now, let me know if that is a Christian virtue. I'm sure it's in the 10 Commandments somewhere. Maybe it's the 11th commandment, steal everything from the Jews because they stole it from you. I wonder if that who knows? who knows? I'm from Africa. Didn't finish my PhD. Who knows? Maybe I'm reading this wrong. Artsy fartsy nerdy wordy says, "Wow, this sounds so Muslim, doesn't it? Doesn't it just sound very Muslim?" So yeah, wow. A football match between Germany and Iran. The Iranian fans did the Nazi salute as a sign of respect while the German anthem was playing. Um, yeah. So let's continue. I can't follow all the comments, unfortunately. So why skip over the Germans like other Europeans had been taught over the long Christian centuries that the Jews were the enemy of Christian civilization? So seal and sand. Now, of course, you're going to try and deflect at this point. You're going to say, can we find the answer in the Talmud? And the answer is most likely no, because I have covered the Talmud. I've done several episodes, not on my channel. I've done some small episodes on the Talmud on my channel. But I will state this. Christians, quote unquote Christians, lie, and lie about the Talmud because they've been taught to lie and they like it. So they lie about the Talmud endlessly. Now, I have spoken on many occasions about legitimate issues you can have and you can discuss with regards to the Pharisees and the history of the Jews and so on. But these would be legitimate issues you can genuinely discuss in an honest manner. Whereas when people are going to talk about the Talmud, I can guarantee you 99.9% of what you and your friends have said are going to say and are saying right now are complete lies, utter lies, total lies. And you will do everything to defend those lies despite regardless of any and all evidence. So yeah, besides, as a Christian, of course, you and I are saying, well, Luther was right, Hitler was right, and the Muslims were right, Muhammad was right. Now, when Christians side with Nazi genocidal jihadis and Hitler, I'm going to question your Christian credentials. I'm going to say that you are not Christian. I'm going to simply state that if you think Hitler was right, then that makes you the bad guy. And if you think Martin Luther was right, that makes you the bad guy. So let me see. So yeah, so this is very, very Muslim, as we can tell, right? Now, many scholars have attempted to understand the destructive nationalism and the nationalism of the Germans and the Nazis, right? Some argued that it all goes back to Martin Luther, for he was the first true nationalist of this kind of modern times, and through him, German nationalism was preached to the people, a new religion was founded, and a German God created. Remember, I have already discussed how Martin Luther said that when he was talking about murdering the peasants, right? He said that, yeah. No, look, I've covered James Vickers. I spent 3 months reading the Talmud, which is 3 months more than any of the liars who lie about the Talmud have spent reading it. I spent 12 weeks of my life reading the Talmud. I spent a lot, hours and hours and hours reading the Talmud. I have a lot of notes in the Talmud. I'll do some episodes on the Talmud again. I'm going to have to, but if you search for my name in Talmud, you're going to find lots of stuff on the Jews that I've covered. Most of what Christians are telling are just lies, and they are bad Catholics too. Just so by the way, they are anti-Semitic, vile, disgusting Catholics that I've met as well. There's some very nasty Catholics out there too. So, but Martin Luther stated that, remember, God kills, God beheads, God hangs, God murders, God, and it's not God, it's not you doing it, that's God's hand that's doing it, which is highly Islamic. I don't know what God Martin Luther's talking about. I have covered that and I will cover it again. We will discuss that at length. So now look, Wally Ram, that's not a bad statement. I mean, there's some truth to that. There's some genuine truth to that, and that's a fair assessment. That's a fair statement. But you'd have to be, but the thing is, most people don't have any fair assessments. Most people are not making calm, rational, logical statements about it. They're simply just lying about the Talmud. So anyway, so a new religion was founded and a German God created. Let's continue. Now, both Luther and Hitler caused more division than unification. Now, that is highly true. Luther and Hitler caused more division than unification. Now, while Luther is known for his theological work with the Protestant Reformation, although since I've been talking about Luther, Protestants are telling me he had nothing to do with the Reformation, fine. He was just as much a political and social figure as religious. So, sure, you seem a bit, okay, Lloyd, you seem a bit condemnatory regarding people who read it and misunderstand it. It seems like an easy mistake to make given the complexity. Well, let's see. Someone who's lying because he knows he's lying, and someone who's lying even though they don't know they're lying, and those lies have an effect, and those lies cause hatred, and those lies have consequences, what's the difference? What is the difference? If someone lies to you intentionally and someone lies to you unintentionally, and both of them refuse to acknowledge the facts, both of them refuse to go and check the facts, both of them refuse to listen to the facts, what's the difference between them? If someone drives over you accidentally with a car and someone drives over you deliberately with the car, either way, you've been driven over with the car. In both cases, you end up in hospital in a very bad shape. So what's the difference? Is there any positive benefit to the one versus the other? No, there is none. So they're liars. Very bluntly, what do you call them? Accidental lies? Does that make it better? They're just liars, period. So anyway, Luther was as much a political and social figure, and he was a highly political figure. The Protestant Reformation had a political and social impact. It increased the amount of war in Europe. The early Protestant movement was a movement of conquest. Believe it. These guys were looking for ways to make war. The liar who does not know they are lying maybe is not lying. So if you tell a lie but you don't know you're lying, it's the truth. James, please be stupid somewhere else. Okay? Please take your stupidity elsewhere. Don't waste my time or yours. Someone who doesn't know they are lying is not telling the truth. They're still lying. They just don't know they're a liar. They're ignorant on top of being dishonest. Okay? So someone who lies and who doesn't know it is still a liar. Might be ignorant too, could be stupid as well. But yeah. So Luther created a divide between Catholic Germans and the Protestant Germans. He further generated separation between the Germans during the Peasants' War. With 100,000 casualties, Luther was labeled as the instigator of the war. The peasants believed him to be a traitor. Luther was an enemy to both sides, creating a larger rift between the people and the princes. Right, so let's continue. The fact that both men were German and had such similar ideologies makes them a wholly unique duo. It is impossible to assume that Luther did not have any influence on Hitler and his views. Hitler refers to Martin Luther as one of the great reformers of history, and as such, one of the great warriors of this world. It cannot be coincidence that Hitler's anti-Jewish sentiment of the 30s and 40s mirrors Luther's anti-Semitism of the 1500s. In fact, the Nazis themselves acknowledged Martin Luther as their spiritual leader. When on trial in Nuremberg, Germany, after World War II, one of Hitler's top officials declared, "Martin Luther would probably sit in my place in the defendant's dock today if this book had been taken into consideration by the prosecution." Dr. Martin Luther writes that the Jews are a serpent's brood and one should burn down their synagogues and destroy them. Okay, so yeah, did someone make that fool disappear? So thank you very much, XYZ. Much appreciated. It was not supposed idiocy, it was genuine idiocy, James. So the Nazis seem to think that he was just as guilty as they, or that they were just as innocent as Martin Luther. Some people in Hitler's time, now don't forget, whenever there was a Nazi rally, Martin Luther's book would be on public display. It would be kept in a glass case so that everyone could see that they were following Christian principles. And don't forget, Martin Luther does state in one of his writings, I've covered this and I will cover it again, that Martin Luther very bluntly states that we must hate the Jews. We must undermine and attack the Jews so that everyone can see that we are Christians, so that God can know that we are Christians. We need to hate and we need to attack the Jews so that God can know that we are Christians, because apparently that's the Christian thing to do. So, okay, Wally Ram, we're not here to talk about the Talmud, okay? So, enough now. Just enough, all right? Some people in Hitler's time went so far as to believe that Hitler was the reincarnation of Luther. The Minister of Education in Nazi Germany wrote, "Since Martin Luther closed his eyes, no such son of our people has appeared again. It has been decided that we shall be the first to witness Martin Luther's reappearance. I think the time is past when one may not say the names of Hitler and Luther in the same breath. They belong together. They are of the same old stamp." So the line from Luther to Hitler runs straight, and that one of the main causes which turned Germany into a country of barbarians was Martin Luther and his German Reformation. So that is, yeah. So, yeah, there we go. So, yeah, they belong together. They belong as part of the same old stamp. So towards the end now, we're going to end in a couple of slides. There are hardly two men in history like Martin Luther and Adolf Hitler, for they are both phenomenons unto themselves. Both have left a remarkable impact not only on Germany, but on the history of the world. One might even ask, if Luther had not written on the Jews and their lives, would Hitler have become fanatically anti-Semitic and murderous? Luther is still remembered, discussed, and debated centuries after his life. And the same is true for Hitler, who was still a controversial figure decades after his death. Hatred alone is a fascinating thing, but coupled with the ability to persuade and convince others to follow these extreme beliefs, this makes it a tragic phenomenon. One must remember that Luther's works influenced Hitler and the Nazi Party, and by prosecuting one, the other must be prosecuted as well. Julius Streicher, one of Hitler's top officials and the publisher of Der Stürmer, an anti-Semitic newspaper, was quoted as saying that Martin Luther would be on trial as well if on the Jews and their lies had been taken into consideration. Last 2 pages. Both Martin Luther and Hitler were egomaniacs who felt superior to the current political and religious systems that regulated the masses. Each man felt that he alone had the correct political and religious process for Germany at the time. Luther and Hitler both used the guise that their revolutions, don't forget, revolutions, not a reformation, a revolution, were in the best interests of the German people, but they cared not for the victims that would suffer from their extreme behavior. The 100,000 dead peasants might think that Luther didn't do them any favors. The end result for Germany was the same: bias and hate towards a specific ethnic group, the Jews, which has now been exported worldwide thanks to Martin Luther. Where Luther saw the Jews as being under a divine curse by the devil, Hitler saw the Jews as a nationalistic threat. To the more religious-oriented Martin Luther, the Jews were the enemy to Jesus, while the politically focused Adolf Hitler saw them as the enemy to Germany. This is not to say that Martin Luther did not have a strong political slant. He was very much politically oriented. Don't think that that wasn't the case. So, despite being one of the most documented events, now this is the Holocaust, just briefly. Despite being one of the most documented events in human history, supported on the one hand by numerous eyewitness testimonies of survivors and liberators, and on the other by German records, written and photographic, there are those who deny the existence of the Holocaust. The inspiration for this denial is simply anti-Semitic hate. Those who want to deny the Holocaust allege either that it did not take place at all, that Hitler never ordered it, that there were no gas chambers and no crematoria in the death camps, or that the deaths of Jews occurred on a much smaller scale than they really did, being due to poor living conditions and not a deliberate policy of extermination. The account the rest of the world believes was made up in order to legitimize the Zionist state. Sometimes there's a less explicit subtext. If the Holocaust didn't happen, it should have, and Hitler didn't finish the job. So, in other words, I've seen often, Hitler never did it, the Holocaust never happened, and Hitler should have finished the job that never happened. Okay, yeah, that's contradictory, but fine. So, there also exists the anti-Semitic behavior known as anti-Zionism. Zionism is the national movement for the return of the Jewish people to their homeland. Now, why should the Jews be the only people on earth not to have a homeland? And of course, you've got like 51 Arab states around them, which is okay, but you can't have one Jewish state that's the size of a postage stamp, right? And the resumption of the Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. Anti-Zionism, therefore, is the movement against it. According to William Nichols, which is of course, the pro-Hamas, pro-jihadi side. Lots of Christians are pro-jihadi. You'd be surprised how many. According to William Nichols, author of Christian Anti-Semitism, he argues that the history of the Middle East conflict is being rewritten to make it appear that in all the 5 wars, I think it's 6 now, between the Arab powers and Israel, or 7, Israel was always the aggressor and always more militarily powerful. Yeah, so unfortunately, the Arabs were always the first aggressors. So yeah, I think that should end it. We can finish here. So yeah, there is an attempt to obviously rewrite history. There's an attempt to lie to us. And I'll just go through this. This is Martin Luther. That's him at 150 plus kilograms, 330 plus pounds. You know, at his death. This is the Nazi rallies. That's good old Adolf, right? One of the Buchenwald concentration camp. And yeah, so that's it. So yeah. Thanks, Just Janice. It's hard to get my head around this. Yeah. So this is even, of course, while you're around. So Okay, so this is information on Martin Luther that is well known within academic circles. You can find plenty of information like this if you know where to look. However, of course, Protestants do not want to talk about this. Historians don't really want to talk about this. It is starting to come out now. And hopefully I'm the one that's starting to make this a common thing. Right? To reinforce, Horst says, to reinforce Lloyd's lecture, everyone should read William Shirer's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. As evil and inhuman as Hitler was, Stalin and Mao are equals. They were worse, if not. So, yeah, Luther was definitely a glutton. Luther was insane. The guy was clearly nuts. So, yeah, guys, this is my talk on this. And I will also now introduce, obviously, I'll go through the Martin Luther material. Let me just close this. And I have shown you guys the Martin Luther stuff. Let's go here. Luther. Here we go. So, yeah, this is on Luther. And we'll be discussing Luther. We'll be going through his impact on Protestantism, on how he introduced so much war into Europe. And Francis Bull, thank you so much. This is eye-opening, but very informative. No, thank you. Yeah, so we'll be talking a lot about this, and of course, something I love showing people, and of course, this is a weak hadith now lately, where Luther says that Christ committed adultery, first of all, with the woman at the well, about whom St. John tells us was not everybody about him saying, "What has Jesus been doing with her?" Secondly, he fornicated with Mary Magdalene, and thirdly, with the woman taken in adultery, whom he dismissed so lightly. Thus, even Christ, who was so righteous, must have been guilty of fornication before he died. That's a very Christian thing to say, no doubt. Here it is. This is the original. Of course, it's in Latin, so they don't want to make it obvious now, do they? So that's the original in Latin down here on the bottom right. So this is in Luther's works. This is quite frankly, this is written in Luther's works. You can see it here. Luther's works, volume 54. Okay. And yeah, that is Martin Luther. He said that. This is in his works. This is supposedly the next live stream. I'll try and do it tomorrow. I can't promise tomorrow or Thursday. I am traveling on Saturday. I'll be gone for a week. So I'll try and do something tomorrow and Thursday. Wednesday, I'm not available. So guys, yeah, it's a week, Hadith. So guys, what have you learned? I'd be very curious to know. Let me know in the comments. But this is a different side of Martin Luther that we've not been told. This gives us a whole new perspective on Martin Luther. Wally Ram, I don't think I'll be talking about the Christian princes, but to some degree they must have put him up to it. You know, they seem to, obviously they wanted someone who could do things in their favor, right? Who could help them, because they wanted to take land and money, and if they could overthrow the Catholic Church, they could steal the land and steal the money. There's a lot of theft involved. There's, quite bluntly, a great deal of theft involved. So there's political and financial benefit to them. Yeah, horrid man, disgusting man. We're just getting started. Yeah. So yeah, we're just getting started on good old Martin Luther. We're gonna have to look at that. So guys, yeah, thank you. I hope you've learned something useful. Come to London, dinner and touristy spot on me. Okay, yeah, when I have a chance. Thank you. So the picture of history keeps getting clearer. So yeah, guys, this is the untold story of Martin Luther. We'll be talking about this at length. So hopefully that was enlightening, illuminating. Hopefully you've learned something, that you're not being told the full truth. And we need to have the facts so we can make the right decisions. So Jesus was a murderer. He could also, he could redeem murderers or an idol. Yeah, that's exactly the story, O8X. But you see, that's assuming that Martin Luther meant it in a metaphorical sense. He didn't mean it in a metaphorical sense. He meant it in a phorical sense. He's calling him an adulterer. There's no idea here that this is metaphorical. He's stating it. Jesus shagged 3 women. Now, how Christian is that? So it's scary how we sometimes research by reading commentary from people we agree with rather than seeing what people like Luther actually wrote and said. Yes. Yeah. So welcome, DMAC and everyone. Thank you, guys. So yeah, thank you very much for your time. I do appreciate your attention, that you've been here. Thank you again for all the support on the channel. I could not have done this research without your financial support. I mean, it was really expensive to get hold of Luther's works and to get some of the materials that I needed. Some of this is still in Latin. Some of it's still in Gothic German. It's very hard to read and find. And also some of it is still hidden by academia. Even the English translations of Martin Luther's works that I have is not complete. So yeah, guys, so there's a lot to be learned. And we're not told the truth, just like we're not told the truth about Muhammad, the same with Martin Luther. So yeah, so there's a lot of implications with calling Jesus a fornicator, and then yeah, there's still some stuff I'm working on. Yeah, in this one, in some of his, let me just do this for you guys so you can see this clearer. Let me show this to you. This last bit here. This is from Lyndall Roper writing a historical text, and they write here in so he writes to Spalatin, okay, asking him for laxatives and entrusting him with these manuscripts because he was quite sickly, and constipation was one of his issues, just one of his many legal issues. He had medical issues. He also had syphilis. There's a good chance he had syphilis. And then in some of his very last letters to his wife, he described his inability to be sexually aroused by the sight of prostitutes, and he blamed Jews for his illness. Yeah, that's what we do, right? That's what we do. Yeah. So yeah. So Luther was channeling Muhammad or something, and then you know, Satan for fun. I don't know. So yeah. Anyway, guys. So that's that. I will end this here. Hopefully, you've learned something, and thank you very much, Dragon. Always appreciate. Corolla 97. Nice name. So guys, thanks. Thumbs up if you liked it. Thumbs down twice if you didn't. And thanks again for all your support. I will see you guys soon. And take care, guys. Yeah, he did need a good feed of fiber, but apparently he was drunk every night. He drank so much wine, he got drunk every night. Momo blamed the Jews for everything. Yeah, they bewitched him, right? So yeah, guys, have a good night. And I hope this was entertaining and interesting. And yeah, we've hopefully shone a light into the darkness and changed the story because I've listened to too many Protestants just tell nonsense about